The world did not expect this, neither did Elon Musk. From a nation often left in the shadows of global maps, a voice has risen clear, confident, and unapologetic. On a dry August morning in 2025 under the searing Sahel sun, the people of Burkina Faso gathered in Ouagadougou not to witness another political speech, but something far rarer: invention born from survival. Standing before them was President Ibrahim Traoré, a man whose hands once held a soldier's rifle and now pointed toward Africa's future. There were no flashing lights, no Western sponsors, no billionaire backers. Only 3 machines built by local engineers and students, quiet, unassuming but powerful enough to shake the foundations of global industry. The first promised water from salt, hope from drought. The second rolled on wheels of dust Africa's first electric military truck, silent yet sovereign. The third hovered above the soil, an agricultural drone guiding seeds to life in lands once doomed to hunger. What do these 3 creations mean for a continent long told to wait for technology from abroad? What happens when a nation with a GDP of less than $20 billion dares to challenge industries worth hundreds of billions? Is this the birth of a new Silicon Valley, not in California, but in the heart of the Sahel? Stay with us, because this is more than a headline. It is a hinge in history, the moment Africa stopped waiting and started building. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, stories of courage, creation, and sovereignty, please like, comment, and subscribe. Your voice keeps the light of truth alive, because every share, every comment, every click is a small act of defiance against the silence that has shadowed Africa for too long. It began in silence, the kind of silence that only comes before revelation. On that August morning in 2025, the streets of Ouagadougou were lined with men, women, and children who had no idea they were about to witness history. There were no red carpets, no CEOs in suits, no foreign flags fluttering behind the podium, only dust, sun, and anticipation. When President Ibrahim Traoré stepped forward, his presence was calm but commanding. His voice carried the weight of generations who had been told Africa could not build, that invention was something to be imported, not created. He paused for a moment, then gestured to 3 covered shapes behind him. Today, he said, we reveal not wealth but will, not luxury but life. The first cloth was lifted. Beneath it stood a small metallic structure no larger than a family refrigerator, a salt-to-freshwater purification system. Its design was humble, its purpose profound. With minimal energy input, it could turn brackish or polluted water into safe drinking water. In a region where thirst kills more often than bullets, it was nothing short of revolutionary. Health workers nearby nodded. They had already seen pilot results in remote villages. Hospital admissions for waterborne disease dropped by nearly 20%. Those numbers might seem small to statisticians, but to a mother in the Sahel, it meant her child could go to school instead of lying in a fevered bed. The crowd gasped, not for the machine's beauty, but for its mercy. Then came the second unveiling. The crowd leaned forward as the cover fell away to reveal Africa's first electric military truck, angular, rugged, coated in red-brown dust. Its engine emitted not a roar, but a hum powered by locally assembled batteries. Built not for parades, but for patrols across endless Sahelian plains, it symbolized more than mobility. It embodied sovereignty made mobile. In a world where imported fuel often dictates the movements of armies, this machine broke the chain. An army that no longer depends on foreign fuel, Traoré said, is an army that defends freedom, not interests. The applause thundered across the plaza. To Western analysts, it might have looked like a prototype. To Burkina Faso soldiers, it was a promise, proof that independence could be engineered, not borrowed. The third unveiling felt almost poetic. A small drone rose into the air, wings buzzing gently. Its camera eyes scanned the soil, its algorithms mapped moisture and fertility in real time. An agricultural drone created by a team of young engineers and agronomists barely out of college. In pilot fields, it had already increased yields by nearly a quarter. But the statistics were not what stirred the crowd, it was what the drone represented. For farmers whose harvests had long depended on guesswork and prayer, this machine offered something priceless: precision, confidence, and dignity. One old farmer was heard whispering, "The sky itself now helps us plant." When all 3 inventions stood side by side, water, mobility, and harvest, the symbolism became impossible to ignore. They were not just machines, they were metaphors. Water for dignity, power for sovereignty, seed for hope. Traoré looked at the audience, then beyond, to the cameras broadcasting across Africa. For decades, he said, they told us to wait. Wait for aid, wait for investors, wait for technology. Today, we wait no more. That declaration drew silence again, not emptiness, but awe. It was the silence of realization, the silence before applause, the silence that marks the birth of something irreversible. In that square under the punishing sun, Burkina Faso's story shifted from a nation surviving drought and dependency to one forging invention out of necessity. No grand orchestras played, no Western anchors narrated the moment. Yet for those who stood there, teachers, engineers, farmers, and children, it felt as though the world had tilted ever so slightly. History for once was being written, not in Paris or Washington, but in Ouagadougou, by hands that had been ignored, yet refused to remain idle. And as the crowd began to chant the president's words, "We build because we must," the scene closed like the first page of a new chapter 1, where Africa's ingenuity was no longer waiting to be discovered. It was already here, alive and breathing through 3 machines that dared to whisper, "The future is ours." The words hung in the air like thunder that refused to fade. The age of dependency is finished. We build because we must, not because we have money. That sentence, simple, almost austere, cracked open a silence older than independence itself. For decades, Africa had been spoken about, but rarely spoken to. It had been the subject of conferences, not the author of change. Yet that morning, in a square of red dust and rising hope, Burkina Faso rewrote the script. The crowd erupted. Men waved their caps in the air, women ululated with joy. Children shouted the president's words as if memorizing history in real time. To them, this was not a political event, it was a resurrection. The feeling was contagious. Within hours, the speech spread across Africa like a spark finding dry grass. In Lagos, students painted "Nar Africa Can Build" on campus walls. In Accra University, hackers gathered in computer labs creating open-source blueprints of the Burkina Faso drone. In Nairobi, engineering faculties launched sovereignty hackathons challenging students to design their own low-cost prototypes. And in Johannesburg, talk radio buzzed with a single phrase, psychological emancipation. For the first time in a long time, Africa's headlines weren't about coup, debt, or disaster. They were about creation, confidence, and courage. But as cheers echoed across the continent, silence filled another set of rooms, the polished boardrooms of the West. In Washington, Paris, and London, officials exchanged uneasy glances. Reports arrived describing unverified technological claims from Ouagadougou. Major news outlets gave the event minimal coverage, framing it as a curiosity, not a breakthrough. Behind closed doors, policy advisors were less dismissive. How did they do it? One analyst reportedly asked. If a country with no car plants and a GDP under $20 billion can produce this, what happens when larger African economies follow? Think tanks scrambled to draft memos. Some warned of a spreading movement of technological sovereignty. Others feared something deeper, that aid programs long used as leverage might lose their hold if African nations proved capable of self-reliance. For defense contractors, an electric military truck designed in Africa was not just competition, it was heresy. For agribusiness giants, a drone that replaced imported machinery threatened profits measured in billions. On Wall Street, the tone turned from mockery to concern. Analysts muttered about disruptive potential and supply chain realignment. In Brussels, officials quietly debated whether to engage or contain the so-called Burkina model. But on the streets of Africa, the story took a different tone. The videos of Traore's unveiling went viral. Music artists sampled his words in songs. Influencers across Ghana, Senegal, and Tanzania made short clips explaining the inventions to their audiences. Even the African diaspora joined in. From Atlanta to Paris. African Americans and Afro-Europeans posted messages of pride and solidarity. One comment, viewed nearly 1 million times, read, "For the first time, my children see Africa not as a victim, but as a creator." The emotional wave was undeniable. Hope turned into movement. Movement turned into momentum. Meanwhile, inside Burkina Faso, the president's words became a mantra. "We build because we must" was painted on factory walls, stitched into student uniforms, printed on banners above schools. Local engineers felt seen, farmers felt heard, soldiers felt valued. The electric truck became a traveling symbol of national pride, parading through towns not as a weapon of war, but as an emblem of independence. The drone hovered above newly seeded fields, its shadow tracing the outline of a new kind of sovereignty, practical local real. And the water purifier, once a prototype, began appearing in villages as a quiet miracle, bringing dignity one cup at a time. Still, the paradox deepened. How could a small landlocked nation without billion-dollar laboratories challenge the technological giants of the world? The answer was not found in balance sheets, but in belief. As one Burkina Faso engineer told the camera, his hands still stained with machine oil, "They have money. We have necessity, and necessity teaches faster." The camera panned across the crowd once more, faces smiling through dust, eyes reflecting pride. What began as an unveiling had turned into a continental awakening. Some revolutions start with bullets, others begin with ideas. This one began with 3 machines and a sentence whispered into history: "We build because we must." History, when it truly shifts, doesn't always announce itself with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives quietly in a village where a mother no longer walks 10 miles for water, or in a classroom where children stay seated because sickness no longer keeps them home. Across Burkina Faso, the impact of those 3 inventions began to take root, not as headlines but as habits. In the dusty villages of the Sahel, the salt-to-freshwater system became a lifeline. Buckets once filled with murky, disease-ridden water now gleamed with clarity. Local clinics reported a sharp drop in cases of diarrhea and cholera. Mothers spoke of their children's laughter returning, their time reclaimed from endless walks to distant wells. "We drink from our own hands now," one woman said, tears cutting paths through the dust on her cheeks. That is freedom. Freedom, not the political kind written into constitutions, but the tangible kind you can taste, hold, and share. Meanwhile, on the outskirts of Ouagadougou, the electric military truck found a new meaning beyond its design. It wasn't just a machine, it was a message. The young soldiers who drove it stood taller, no longer seen as extensions of foreign aid, but as guardians of national innovation. A quiet pride filled the barracks. The hum of the electric engine became the sound of a new kind of independence, one powered by African hands, not imported fuel. For the farmers, the agricultural drone changed everything. It flew over the fields like a guardian angel, mapping moisture, planting seeds, guiding timing. Yields rose by nearly a quarter, but the deeper transformation was emotional. Where once farmers guessed and prayed, now they planned and prospered. One elder farmer put it simply, "Before the sky told us when to plant, now we tell the sky." Each of these changes, modest on the surface, began to redefine citizenship itself. The people no longer saw their government as distant or foreign-backed. They saw results built in local workshops by their neighbors, by their sons and daughters. It was not aid, it was authorship. That authorship had political consequences. In a continent long judged by its negotiations with the IMF or World Bank, President Ibrahim Traoré introduced a new metric of leadership: the ability to build sovereignty through innovation. His slogan, "We build because we must," moved from rally cry to governing principle. Even critics within Burkina Faso, opposition politicians, skeptical economists, found themselves unable to ignore the visible results. When a president delivers clean water instead of empty promises, when soldiers drive homegrown vehicles, when farmers harvest enough to sell at market, legitimacy becomes tangible. It becomes something that cannot be faked or imported. Internationally, the ripple effect was unmistakable. In Ghana, civil society groups began pushing for local desalination projects. In Nigeria, youth forums demanded investment in domestic defense technologies. In Kenya, students rallied for government-backed agricultural innovation hubs. A common refrain spread across the continent: if Burkina Faso can, why not us? For many African leaders, this question was uncomfortable. For their citizens, it was liberating. Yet every act of liberation invites resistance. Western corporations began whispering warnings about unsustainable models. Lobbyists in Brussels and Washington urged caution, fearful of losing influence in Africa's defense and agricultural sectors. Disinformation trickled through the media, subtle doubts about the viability of Burkina Faso's innovations. But on the ground, reality spoke louder. The people saw change with their own eyes. The machines worked, the water flowed, the harvest grew. And the pride, that unquantifiable currency of dignity, became contagious. This was no longer about prototypes. It was about a new political language, one written not in policies or speeches, but in machines built by the people for the people. Burkina Faso, once dismissed as a footnote in global reports, had become something new, a mirror reflecting what Africa could be when belief becomes its own source of power. While celebrations spread across Africa, a very different atmosphere settled in the halls of power thousands of miles away. In Washington, Paris, and London, the announcement from Burkina Faso did not appear on front pages. It was buried in the middle of financial sections labeled as claims of innovation. But behind the calm headlines, the reaction was anything but casual. At the Pentagon, analysts reviewed footage of the electric military truck not because of its performance, but because of what it symbolized: a potential shift in global defense dependency. If African armies start building their own vehicles, one report warned they'll stop buying ours. In Brussels, similar anxiety unfolded. Defense contractors who once held monopoly over supply chains now saw a new threat: African engineering independence. Think tanks in Washington held closed-door meetings under the banner of technological sovereignty and global stability. The tone was cautious, even alarmed. One memo leaked to the press asked, "What happens when Africa stops being a market and starts being a manufacturer?" To Western policymakers, the implications were vast. Entire aid structures, trade policies, and diplomatic leverage systems were built on the assumption that Africa needed technology, not that it could create it. Burkina Faso's demonstration disrupted that assumption. Across the Atlantic, in New York's financial circles, investors watched nervously. Water purification, defense, mobility, and agri-tech, three industries worth over $200 billion globally, now had an unpredictable new player. Analysts whispered about a symbolic shockwave from the Sahel. For some, it was an inconvenience. For others, it was an opportunity, a sign that new partnerships outside traditional Western frameworks might emerge. In contrast, reactions from the Global South were immediate and proud. China's state media praised Traoré's vision as evidence of a multipolar world where innovation no longer carries a Western passport. Russia called it proof that sovereignty is the new currency of power. India, seizing the moment, offered to share expertise in low-cost production, positioning itself as a collaborator, not a controller. Within the African Union, the tone was one of cautious celebration. Delegates debated whether the Burkina model could be replicated across member states. Some called for the creation of Pan-African innovation hubs, training centers, and patent-sharing frameworks. For the first time in decades, the discussion in Addis Ababa wasn't about aid allocation, it was about autonomy. Meanwhile, in the African diaspora, the emotional resonance was profound. Across Atlanta, Chicago, London, and Paris, Africans and African Americans organized forums, podcasts, and fundraisers celebrating the three machines of freedom. Tech professionals who had left the continent for better opportunities began talking about going back. A comment circulating online captured the mood perfectly. "We left home looking for progress. But now home has found it first." And then there was the question few dared to ask aloud: how would the United States respond? For decades, American foreign policy in Africa has been built on aid, security cooperation, and soft power diplomacy. But if nations like Burkina Faso start building their own solutions, if their youth see independence not as ideology but as industry, the traditional playbook loses its power. For older Americans watching this unfold, the story feels strangely familiar. A people once underestimated, standing up against odds, determined to build their own destiny. It echoes the very founding spirit of America itself. That's what makes this moment so powerful and so unsettling. Because when a nation long ignored dares to innovate, it challenges not only global hierarchies, but the idea of who gets to define progress. And as the hum of electric engines rolled across the Sahel, the message reached even the skyscrapers of New York. The future no longer waits for permission. Every invention carries two lives, the one that exists today and the one it makes possible tomorrow. In Burkina Faso, those two lives have just begun. The water purifier, the electric truck, and the agricultural drone are no longer mere machines. They are symbols, proof that dignity can be engineered, that sovereignty can be built, and that hope can indeed be designed by human hands. But every symbol carries a test. The road ahead will not be smooth. Scaling production will require capital, training, and infrastructure. Global corporations whose profits depend on African dependency will push back through policy, propaganda, and pressure. The same media that once ignored Africa's achievements may soon question their legitimacy. And within the continent itself, not every leader will welcome a movement that threatens old alliances built on aid and obedience. Yet this is how every revolution begins, quietly through action, not announcements. For the people of Burkina Faso, independence is no longer a word written in a constitution. It is a cup of clean water, a silent engine, a seed that grows without foreign permission. Across the continent, a whisper grows louder. If Burkina Faso can, why not us? And that whisper, if it becomes a chorus, could reshape not only Africa's destiny, but the world's balance of power. Because once a continent begins to believe in its own capacity, no empire can control it again. To those watching from afar, perhaps from living rooms in New York or Paris, this story is more than geopolitics. It's a mirror. It asks uncomfortable but necessary questions. Are we prepared for an Africa that stands on its own terms? Can we, the so-called developed world, accept equality instead of dominance? And will we choose partnership or repeat the patterns of control? For President Ibrahim Traoré, the answer is already written. Freedom is not charity, it is a right. His words echo far beyond Ouagadougou. They reach classrooms in Ghana, workshops in Kenya, and even the quiet minds of older generations in the West who still remember what it means to build from nothing. So before this story fades from your feed, pause and ask yourself, do you believe Africa can claim authorship of its own future? Do you see in these inventions the first sparks of a continental awakening or just a passing headline? Your voice matters. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that human potential knows no borders, share this video, leave a comment, and subscribe. Because history isn't written by those who watch silently. It's written by those who choose to see hope and pass it forward. And somewhere tonight, as three machines hum softly in the heart of the Sahel, the question remains, will the world be ready when Africa rises?